My name is Sophia Bell, 31 years old, a captain in the United States Army. McGee Tyson Airport at 5:14 in the morning was buried in a bone-chilling cold. But it did not compare to the scene right in front of my eyes. 11 people who shared my exact bloodline stood in a neat line, checking in for a trip to Europe. At the edge of the formation stood my grandmother, 74 years old, clutching an old leather suitcase patched with tape since 1994. She was just waiting. But her name did not exist on the system. My father, Richard, a 54-year-old man wearing a flannel shirt, turned around holding a Starbucks cup in his hand. He looked directly into the eyes of his own mother, the woman who had handed over $30,000 of her retirement money for this trip. His voice was not lowered at all, sharp as a knife. "Mom, I forgot to book your ticket. Just catch a taxi home. I will video call you from Rome." My grandmother stood frozen. 11 blood relatives, including my aunt and my stepmother, turned away. They adjusted their scarves. They ignored it. Not a single person opened their mouth to defend an old woman discarded right at security. On the battlefield, strangers were willing to shield me from bullets. Here, blood relatives abandon each other for a few $1,000s. They thought I would stay silent because of family. They forgot I am a soldier. Tell me your state in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if your own relatives have ever drained you dry to the last drop of blood. The counterattack has just officially begun. The terminal smelled of burnt coffee grounds. The click-clack of the gate agent hitting keys sounded like a countdown. My grandmother, Hazel, stood there with thin shoulders pulled inward, looking smaller than ever. Her pale fingers trembled as she slowly snapped shut her cheap plastic wallet. It was empty. No cash, no boarding pass, just a complete void where her own dignity used to be. Richard did not even blink. He shrugged, adjusted his flannel collar, and gripped his luggage cart. The cart was loaded high with heavy, shiny Samsonite suitcases under the harsh lighting of Gate B-17. Brand new, bought with money that did not belong to him. Without another word, he pushed it forward, the wheels squeaking as he walked toward security. Right beside him, my Aunt Diane was absorbed in her phone screen. She raised her hand, adjusting the strap of her fake Coach purse. Her polished fingernails tapped aggressively against the glass. She did not look up, intentionally directing her gaze away from the elderly woman standing 3 feet away. She needed to pretend she was an innocent bystander who had nothing to do with this execution. Behind them, my stepmother Brenda stood silently, wearing a new winter coat, her expression entirely satisfied. Her silence was a signed contract. The collective silence of those 11 human beings felt like a physical weight settling onto my chest. It was heavy, suffocating, the exact quiet that happens right before an ambush in a desert valley. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing terminal air fill my lungs, and my perspective shifted. The vacation was dead. The family dynamic was dead. I was no longer a daughter on leave. I was an officer stepping onto a battlefield. I took 2 long, measured strides forward. My boots made a solid, heavy thud against the floor, a sound honed by years of marching on hard gravel. I planted my body firmly between my grandmother and the retreating, broad back of my biological father. I was a physical wall blocking his escape from reality. I looked down at the paper plane ticket resting in my right hand. It was a premium round-trip ticket to Paris, with my legal name printed across the top. It represented a temporary break from the dirt, the heat, and the heavy ghosts of my past deployments. It was a hard-earned reward. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I brought both of my hands together, gripped the edges of the heavy ticket stock, and twisted them violently in opposite directions. The sound was sharp and dry, a crisp, loud snap of tearing fibers that echoed through the waiting area. Richard stopped walking. The squeak of his luggage cart died instantly. He turned his head slowly over his shoulder, his thick eyebrows drawing into an irritated scowl. He looked at the torn paper in my hand, then looked up at my face, using the childhood nickname he always deployed to enforce authority. "Joe, what the hell are you doing?" he snapped, his voice tight with sudden public embarrassment. I stared directly into his eyes. My jaw was locked, my spine perfectly straight, and my facial muscles did not twitch an inch. I had looked at armed insurgents with this exact face. "I'm going home with Grandma," I said. My voice was low, flat, and completely devoid of any emotional residue. It was an order, not an explanation. Richard opened his mouth to reply, his chest puffing out as he prepared to launch into a loud manipulation. I did not give him the satisfaction of an audience. Before he could utter a single syllable, I turned my back on him, completely cutting him out of my field of vision. I brushed past him, ignoring his furious stare. Bending down, I lifted Hazel's 1994 leather suitcase. It felt heavy, laden with calculated betrayal. I looped my arm through hers, keeping her upright. "Let us go, ma'am." The automatic doors hissed open to freezing December wind and bus diesel fumes. I threw the bag into a taxi trunk. Through the glass, the plane started its engines. My leave was over. A new campaign was activated. Looking through the mirror, my eyes narrowed. A guy who controls finances never forgets tickets. This is a deliberate robbery. The rusted iron gate rattled against its rotting post as the Lincoln Town car dropped us off on the cracked gravel driveway. Walking up to Hazel's modest ranch-style house, a sudden prickle of goosebumps erupted along my arms. It was not from the biting Tennessee wind slicing through my jacket. It was an old tactical trigger, a hardwired survival instinct screaming that the baseline of this environment was completely broken. A home that once boasted perfectly ironed linen napkins and spotless white wood siding now felt heavy with decay. Outside, the aluminum gutters hung limp, warped, and split down the seams, choked with wet, black leaves from past autumns. Freezing gray water dripped onto the porch foundation, feeding a slick carpet of emerald green moss that crawled up the concrete steps. Stepping through the front door, the indoor air hit me like a block of ice. I walked directly to the digital thermostat mounted on the hallway drywall. The display was locked at 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 62 degrees, in the dead of December. My grandmother walked past me into the kitchen, her old bones stiff from the ride. Without a word, she reached out and turned the dial on the electric stove, watching the heating element glow red before hovering her thin, bruised hands an inch above the bare coils. She did not complain. She just stood there in her own kitchen, trying to absorb enough warmth to stop her shoulders from shaking. It was a visual execution of her pride. I crossed the linoleum floor and pulled open the heavy door of the old Whirlpool refrigerator. The compressor kicked on with a pathetic, wheezing rattle. Inside, the small yellow bulb illuminated a barren wasteland. 2 plastic cups of store-brand yogurt, 3 weeks past their expiration date, sat next to a stale, half-empty loaf of white sandwich bread twisted shut with a rusty wire. That was everything. On the counter next to the sink, a small plastic bottle caught my eye. The familiar name-brand label of her chronic blood pressure medication had been replaced by a generic white sticker with the cheapest equivalent text printed across the front. My skin turned cold. Richard drove a brand-new, metallic gray Ford F-150 with premium leather interior, yet he left the woman who gave him life to survive like a street beggar in a house she spent 40 years paying off. A soft knock at the back door broke the suffocating quiet. I turned and found Loretta standing on the porch, her gray hair tucked under a knit cap, holding a warm apple pie wrapped in a stained kitchen towel. The 70-year-old neighbor stepped inside, her eyes darting across the cold kitchen before landing on me. She did not waste time with polite pleasantries. She set the pie down on the Formica counter, her face tightening into a grim expression as she spoke in a hushed, blue-collar Southern drawl. "Hazel has not been to the Cracker Barrel for Sunday dinner in over 3 months, Sophia," she whispered, glancing toward the living room where my grandmother was setting down her purse. "She told me she just did not have the cash for a plate of meatloaf anymore. And your daddy. That truck of his rolls up here every 2 weeks. He parks by the curb for exactly 5 minutes, clears out her entire mailbox, and tears down the road before she can even get out of bed. He's keeping her isolated, honey." The neighborhood intelligence network had just painted a bullseye on the target. By midnight, the house was dark and silent, save for the rhythmic, raspy sound of Hazel's snoring drifting from her bedroom down the hall. I sat in the small home office, the old floorboards groaning slightly beneath my weight as I shifted my stance. my hands were perfectly steady. I picked up a flathead screwdriver from the workbench in the garage and stepped up to the flimsy, olive-drab metal filing cabinet tucked into the corner of the room. It was a cheap, two-drawer unit with a basic lock. I inserted the metal tip of the tool into the keyway, applied a fraction of leverage, and gave it a sharp, calculated twist. The low-grade locking mechanism gave way with a metallic snap that sounded incredibly loud in the deadhouse. I slid the bottom drawer open, the rusted rollers screeching against the track. Inside, a chaotic mess of warning notices and past-due electric bills lay crumpled together. I dug deeper, my fingers filtering through the layers of structural neglect. Near the very bottom, hidden beneath a stack of final utility warnings, my hand closed around a crisp, white document bearing a formal legal header. I pulled it into the dim light of the desk lamp. My eyes locked onto the bold print at the top of the page, durable power of attorney. The legal language was dense, but the ultimate reality was clear. Right there, stamped and dated with a notary seal, was my father's signature. Richard Farrell was listed as the sole beneficiary, granted absolute authority over every single asset, bank account, and cent my grandmother possessed. He had full control. The safety pin of the grenade had been pulled long ago, and he was just waiting for the blast. I stared at the black ink, my heart hammering a cold, steady rhythm against my ribs as the full scope of the operation revealed itself. He had systematically stripped her defensive armor, block by block, leaving her defenseless in her own home while he financed his premium European vacation. He had left her with empty cabinets and generic pills while he toasted champagne in premium class. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over the glass screen as I dialed the 24-hour emergency hotline for the local First Horizon Bank branch. The mechanical ringback tone began to hum in my ear, cutting through the very freezing darkness of the room as I prepared to launch my first major tactical strike. The morning sun offered no comfort, cutting through the tinted windows of the First Horizon Bank branch with a blinding, sterile glare. I stood perfectly erect behind my grandmother's chair, my fingers pressed flat against the edge of the cold laminate desk. I pressed down hard, applying enough physical pressure to stop my hands from shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. Across from us, the branch manager, Tina, shifted uncomfortably in her ergonomic chair, a thin layer of nervous sweat breaking out across her forehead. The continuous harsh whir and click-clack of the heavy matrix printer spitting out page after page of transaction history felt like a slow execution. Tina turned the glowing monitor toward us, her eyes refusing to make contact with mine. The numbers on the screen did not lie. They stripped away every last shred of familial illusion with a brutal, mathematical precision. 5 years ago, the account balance stood at a solid $212,000, the entire life savings of a widow who had spent her prime teaching English to ungrateful teenagers. The current balance displayed a pathetic $41,600. More than $140,000 had evaporated into thin air under a single legal designation. One name authorized every transaction: Richard Farrell. My biological father had treated my grandmother's savings like his personal casino. The printed statements laid bare the specific tracks of a parasite. Every single withdrawal was a deliberate knife thrust into an old woman's back. He withdrew $12,000 under the clean label of home improvement. During the exact month the aluminum gutters collapsed and started rotting the porch wood, he drained another $8,000 for medical expenses, a blatant lie considering the federal Medicare program covered every single bottle of her heart medication down to the last penny. But the ultimate blow, the dagger that sliced straight through Hazel's remaining illusions, was a massive $30,000 cash withdrawal stamped exactly 8 weeks ago. The memo line contained 2 words written in his arrogant, looping handwriting: travel fund. It was the exact price of 3 premium-class round-trip tickets to Europe. I stared at that $30,000 figure, my jaw tightening until my teeth ached. My mind flashed back to the dusty trenches of Kandahar, the suffocating heat of the desert, and the bone-deep exhaustion of past deployments. I remembered exactly how many freezing nights I spent sleeping on gravel, how many stale, vacuum-sealed meals ready to eat I choked down in war zones just to stack away my combat hazard pay. I had risked my life for my savings. Richard had stolen a fortune with a single, effortless stroke of a stolen pen. It was a disgusting display of middle-class American greed, a complete theft of a mother's life to finance a fake lifestyle of luxury. Hazel did not flinch. She sat with her spine rigid, her old-school teacher posture reasserting itself like iron armor. She reached out, her pale fingers remarkably steady as she adjusted her reading glasses on the bridge of her nose. She did not shed a single tear. There was no theatrical wailing, no desperate pleading for answers that would never come. Instead, she quietly took the thick stack of paper from the manager's desk. She folded the document into perfect quarters, using her thumbnail to press the creases completely flat until the edges were sharp. She slid the paper deep into her black vinyl purse, right next to the fake flight itinerary Richard had printed out to deceive her. The absolute trust of a mother had turned to cold ash right there on the bank counter. That night, the ranch house was as quiet as a tomb. The digital thermostat still hovered at that miserable 62 degrees, the cold creeping through the floorboards to numb our toes. We sat opposite each other at the worn kitchen table, illuminated by a single overhead bulb. Hazel looked at me, her blue eyes sharp and clear, stripped of any remaining maternal delusion. The fragile old woman from the airport was gone. In her place sat the woman who had spent 40 years running a classroom with absolute authority. She spoke, her southern drawl low and unwavering. "I saved every single cent of that money over 22 long years, Sophia," she said, her voice cutting through the freezing quiet. "I never questioned a single paper he brought me because he came from my own body. A mother should never be forced to audit her own child." She reached out and pushed the folded bank statement across the table, sliding it until it rests against my knuckles. "Repair it, Sophia. Restore what he took. Reclaim our name." I nodded once, accepting the mission. "Before we advance this tactical operation into the next phase, I need to know you are standing in this trench with us. If you have ever watched a greedy relative drain an elderly family member dry, or if you believe a mother's dignity is worth fighting for, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel right now. It helps us keep this story going against these parasites. Drop a single word in the comments section below. Tell me the name of your home state so I know where our army is watching from. Let us show them we do not stay silent when family betrays family." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy military-issue smartphone, the dark glass screen reflecting the harsh overhead light of the kitchen. My thumb hovered over the contact list, scrolling quickly past the names of active duty squads and base commanders until I found the specific civilian legal asset I needed for a total scorched earth campaign. I tapped the name, and the screen instantly displayed the office number for Marcus Webb, the most ruthless and unforgiving elder law attorney in the entire state of Tennessee. I pressed the call button, letting the line ring into the dark night as the real battle finally began. By day 6, the house felt frozen from the inside out. I sat in the dark kitchen, the only light coming from my glowing smartphone screen. The Farrell family iMessage chat vibrated constantly, relentless and cruel. Image after image flooded the feed. Richard lifted a crystal glass of red wine against the hills of Tuscany. Diane wore an oversized straw hat, eating dark chocolate gelato by a canal in Venice. Brenda posed in a new wool coat, flashing a smug smile. Not a single text message asked if Hazel was alive. Nobody checked to see if she had survived after being discarded like trash at gate B-17. I scrolled through the bright photographs, my jaw clenched so hard the bone ached. These were not vacation memories. This was a digital crime log, updated in real time by arrogant thieves. I walked down the narrow hallway to the small home office. I sat down in front of Hazel's old Dell desktop computer, a machine manufactured in 2012. I pressed the power button. The cooling fan inside the tower began to rumble and groan like a dying engine in a ditch. The monitor flickered to life, casting a cold, pale blue light across my face. Richard had set up this email account for her years ago, establishing himself as the administrator so he could monitor her digital footprint. He thought he was clever. He thought a country school teacher and a soldier would never understand his basic security protocols. It took me exactly 3 minutes to bypass his sloppy security questions. I gained full entry into the primary server and pulled open the master inbox folder. My fingers moved across the keys without a sound, a habit drilled into me from writing encoded radio logs under enemy surveillance. I clicked on the sent mail archive and typed 2 words into the search bar. Flight ticket. The screen lagged before a single message from 3 months ago populated the top line. It was an email from Richard sent directly to Diane's private account. The text was short, blunt, and entirely devoid of human empathy. I read the words aloud to the empty room, my voice flat. Do not book the ticket for the old lady. I already printed out a fake itinerary to show her at the house. She is senile and half-blind anyway, so she will never notice the money is missing from the account. Attached were the digital receipts for 3 business-class round-trip tickets to Europe, totaling $12,600 charged directly to my grandmother's retirement fund. Richard had used her life savings to buy luxury comfort for himself while leaving his mother with an empty wallet. But the digital trail did not stop at the airline tickets. The sickness ran deeper into the family tree. I opened the primary linked financial folder, pulling up the history of internal bank transfers between the family accounts over the past 24 months. My eyes locked onto an entry from 2 years ago. A massive sum of $25,000 had been moved directly from Hazel's primary retirement account into Diane's personal checking account at First Horizon. The official memo line filled out by Richard read, "Emergency roof repair." I knew for a fact the roof had never been touched. The green moss outside on the foundation was proof enough. Diane was not an innocent bystander at the airport. Her total silence at Gate B-17 had been purchased and paid for 2 years in advance with $25,000 of stolen retirement money. By day 8, I was sitting across from a different kind of operator. The office of Marcus Webb smelled of heavy tobacco smoke, old leather books, and stale drip coffee. Marcus was a 60-year-old attorney with the sharp, unblinking eyes of a timber wolf, sitting behind a massive scarred oak desk. I did not waste time with small talk or emotional complaints. I simply slid the heavy manila folder across the oak surface. The folder contained the printed bank statements, the hacked iMessage logs, and the copies of the secret emails between my father and my aunt. Marcus picked up the pages, his face remaining completely expressionless as he scanned the evidence line by line. The room remained dead silent for 5 long minutes, save for the low click of the ceiling fan spinning overhead. Marcus finally stopped at the printed digital email chain, his thumb rubbing the edge of the paper. He leaned back in his leather chair, the old springs groaning loudly in the quiet room. He picked up a heavy black fountain pen, tapping the metal cap against the desk with a slow, deliberate cadence. "This is clear premeditated behavior," Marcus said, his voice a deep baritone that carried the weight of 30 years in local courtrooms. "We have got fraud, forgery, and systematic financial exploitation of an endangered senior citizen. This is a slam dunk in any court in Tennessee." He paused, his sharp eyes locking directly onto my face. "Captain Bell, do you want me to fire a warning shot, or do you want me to carpet bomb?" I did not blink. I adjusted my posture, sitting with my hands resting flat on my knees, my expression completely frozen. "Carpet bomb," I said. The single word cut through the air like a heavy round. Marcus let out a low, grim chuckle that did not reach his eyes. He leaned forward, pulled a fresh legal pad from his drawer, and signed his name at the bottom of a blank motion form with a sharp, aggressive stroke. He slammed the thick manila folder shut, the loud report echoing off the book-lined walls like a gunshot. He looked up at me, his jaw set in a hard line. "Consider it done. I am filing for an emergency asset freeze with the county judge before the clerk closes today. By tomorrow morning, every single credit card in your father's wallet will turn into a useless piece of melting plastic." At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning on day 11, the glass doors of the Knox County Courthouse swung open. Attorney Marcus Webb stepped out onto the concrete plaza, looking down at me. He raised his right hand, flashing a solid thumbs up. The emergency motion was granted. The county judge had signed the temporary protective order without a single hesitation. With that single stroke of a pen, my father's durable power of attorney was legally revoked. 3 bank accounts at First Horizon and 2 primary credit lines were instantly frozen from the centralized computer system. A single keystroke completely severed my father's financial oxygen. Years ago, I sat in a dirt bunker overlooking an Afghan valley, calculating how to cut the supply routes of insurgents to force them out into the open. It was a calculated exercise in logistical starvation. Now, I deployed that exact military tactical strategy against my own father. The mechanics of the ambush were identical. The only difference was that this target carried my own bloodline. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the evening sun was setting over Venice, Italy. Inside a high-end seafood restaurant filled with wealthy tourists and the heavy scent of garlic butter, Richard Farrell stood at the host station. His face was deeply flushed, his neck bulging against the tight collar of his flannel shirt. He tilted his head back with an arrogant chuckle, pulling a sleek Visa Platinum card from his leather wallet. He flicked his wrist, tossing the card onto the counter in front of the young Italian server. He wanted everyone in the room to notice his status, to see the wealth he had stolen from his mother's retirement fund. Behind him, my stepmother Brenda adjusted her brand new designer scarf, looking around the elegant dining room with absolute superiority. The server picked up the card, sliding it through the processing terminal. The small plastic box emitted a sharp, mechanical beep. A solid red light began to flash on the screen, illuminating a single word across the digital display. Decline. Richard blinked, his arrogant smile freezing instantly. He cleared his throat loudly, a heavy bead of sour sweat breaking out along his hairline and soaking into his flannel collar. He forced a loud fake laugh, waving his hand dismissively at the server. He claimed there must be a temporary issue with his business travel account. He reached into his wallet, his fingers trembling as he pulled out a secondary platinum card. The server took it without a word, his expression hardening into absolute professionalism. Another slide, another loud beep. Decline. The server slowly handed both cards back, his dark eyes looking at Richard with absolute disgust. Brenda noticed the shift, her face twisting into an angry scowl as she complained loudly about the public embarrassment. The middle-class American luxury shattered completely on the restaurant floor. Back in Tennessee, the modest ranch house was buried in an absolute, heavy quiet. The air inside the kitchen was completely still, smelling faintly of the fresh chamomile tea brewing on the stove. The digital thermostat on the wall remained locked at 62 degrees Fahrenheit, but neither of us cared. The cold could not touch us now. Hazel sat perfectly rigid at the worn formica table, her spine straight as an iron rod. She held her teacup with both hands, her pale fingers steady as she took a slow, deliberate sip. The steam rose smoothly into the cold air. There was no panic in her eyes, no desperate tears for the son who had abandoned her at gate B17. There was only a heavy, clinical stillness. The mechanical wall clock above the sink went tick-tack, tick-tack, counting down the seconds. We were just waiting for the blast. The sudden ring of the old landline telephone on the kitchen wall shattered the quiet like an explosion. I did not rush. I walked slowly across the linoleum floor, my boots making a solid, measured thud. I lifted the heavy plastic receiver and pressed it to my ear, keeping my body perfectly still. Richard's voice instantly blared through the speaker from half a world away, sounding frantic, thin, and entirely unhinged. He was breathing heavily, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. He screamed that his credit cards were failing, that the hotel desk clerk was threatening to call the local police because he could not settle the room bill. He ordered me to go into the home office immediately, to boot up the old Dell desktop computer and check if my grandmother had accidentally locked the main account. He was completely blind to reality. I leaned my shoulder against the edge of the wooden kitchen cabinet, looking over at my grandmother. She did not flinch at the sound of his frantic screaming. She did not raise her eyes from her teacup. I let the line bleed silence for 5 long seconds, letting his panic marinate in the quiet room. When I finally spoke, my voice was a flat, even baritone, entirely devoid of emotional residue. "I do not know, Father," I said, my words cold and precise. "Maybe it is a system error. Good luck resolving it." Before he could utter another syllable, I pressed the end button. I set the heavy receiver back onto its hook, cutting his connection completely. The line went dead. The supply route was choked. The tactical reaction from the target was instantaneous. A parasite cannot survive without a host, and Richard could not tolerate a loss of control. 2 days later, ahead of any scheduled itinerary, a massive commercial aircraft slammed its heavy rubber wheels onto the runway of the local airport. The countdown had expired much sooner than we anticipated. The piece of the rural ridge road outside our house was torn apart by the roar of a racing engine. The metallic gray Ford F-150 tore around the final gravel bend, its heavy all-terrain tires screeching furiously against the burning asphalt as it accelerated directly toward our driveway. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon on day 17, the piece of the ridge road shattered. The metallic gray Ford F-150 did not slow down as it approached the driveway. It tore over the curb, the thick tires spinning violently and tearing deep ruts into the soft winter grass of the front lawn. Mud sprayed against the white wooden siding of the house. A second later, the heavy truck door slammed shut with a sharp report that sounded like a rifle shot across the quiet valley. Footsteps pounded heavily up the steps of the front porch. The heavy front door flew open without a single warning knock, the wooden frame slamming violently against the hallway wall. Richard Farrell stormed into the kitchen. He was deeply unkempt, his face covered in gray stubble, and his eyes were shot through with thick red lines of blood from a frantic flight and total financial panic. He smelled of sour sweat and cheap cologne. He marched into the room, his chest heaving as he prepared to unleash a wave of absolute authority. He expected to find a weeping old woman and a submissive daughter waiting for his judgment. Instead, he stepped into a fortified command center. The worn Formica kitchen table had been stripped entirely bare of its usual floral tablecloth. In its precise place sat 3 thick manila folders, aligned with extreme geometric precision. One folder was marked with a blue stripe, one with red, and one with yellow. My military laptop sat next to them, the screen glowing steadily and casting a cold white light across the wood. Resting squarely in the center of the table was the official restraining order, the certified seal of the Knox County Court reflecting the overhead bulb. I sat completely motionless in my chair, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. My eyes did not lift to look at his face. I kept my gaze locked on the muddy heels of his designer leather boots. Richard took 2 aggressive strides forward, bringing his heavy fists down onto the table with a violent smash. The wooden legs groaned under the impact. "Who authorized an asset freeze on my accounts?" he roared, his voice cracking as he reached a desperate pitch. "I am the eldest son of this family. The financial security of this household is my responsibility. You ruined my name." He leaned forward, his face inches from mine, trying to use his booming volume to trigger the submission he had enforced for decades. He was trying to rewrite reality right in front of my eyes. He was trying to turn himself into the innocent victim of an ungrateful child. I did not shift my weight. I did not flinch. I let the echo of his shouting die completely before I exhaled. "Used to be," I said. The 3 syllables fell between us like heavy blocks of lead. Richard choked on his next breath, his jaw dropping open as his entire face turned a dangerous shade of purple. Before he could reassemble his manipulation, a soft rustle of fabric sounded from the dark hallway. My grandmother Hazel stepped into the light of the kitchen. She was wearing her plain, faded gray house dress, but her head was held high, her posture completely erect like a heavy wooden mast surviving a coastal gale. She did not look like a confused victim anymore. She looked at her only son with an expression of absolute, freezing neutrality. Her voice carried the steady, unyielding cadence of a woman who had spent 40 years commanding respect at the front of a schoolroom. "I used to possess $212,000 in my retirement account, Richard," she said, her blue eyes drilling straight into his skull. "Now I possess 41,000, and I possess a son who forgot to purchase my plane ticket." The absolute weight of her words struck him like a physical blow. The grand illusion of his righteous protective facade was instantly stripped away, leaving nothing but a small, caught thief standing in a cold kitchen. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The toxic gaslighting was completely dead. The manipulation had completely failed. In a desperate burst of impotent fury, he swung his heavy boot forward and kicked a wooden dining chair completely over. The chair crashed against the linoleum floor, its legs splintering with a sharp snap. He spat a filthy curse into the air, turned on his heel, and fled from the house, slamming the door behind him as he ran from the undeniable truth of his own actions. If you are listening to this standoff and your blood is boiling for Hazel, I need you to stand on the front lines with us right now. Do not let these toxic parasites win the war against our elders. Show your absolute support for this counterattack by hitting that like button and subscribing to this channel immediately. It is the only way we can keep fighting for the dignity of abandoned parents. Drop a comment below with the single word, justice, so I know our army is ready to march. Let us show them that we will never stay silent when family tries to manipulate the people who built their world. The roar of the F-150 engine screamed in the driveway as he tore away, leaving the smell of burning rubber hanging in the cold air. I did not waste a single second watching him retreat. I reached down, opened my smartphone, and dialed the office of Marcus Webb. The line picked up on the very first ring. "Webb," the gravelly voice answered. I looked over at my grandmother, who was already calmly lifting the fallen chair back onto its feet, her face completely set in stone. "Set the table, Marcus," I said, my voice dead and completely decisive. "The target has returned. Summon every single one of them to the office on Tuesday morning." I hung up the phone, the final trap officially set. At 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, day 20, the family kitchen table became a military tribunal. Every plate and mug had been cleared away, leaving absolutely nothing but the bare, freezing cold wood surface. The overhead fluorescent light hummed with a low vibration, casting a cold glare across the room. Attorney Marcus Webb sat at the head of the table like a presiding judge. I stood behind him in the corner, my boots planted on the cold floor, my palms flat against an empty wooden chair. I held my posture perfectly straight, executing the silent vigilance of a sentry. Beside the lawyer, my grandmother Hazel sat as rigid as stone. She wore her fine, cream-colored church dress with the polished mother-of-pearl buttons fastened tightly up to her throat. She did not look like a victim. Her calm presence radiated absolute authority. The narrow space was thick with a suffocating tension that made the air feel completely stagnant. The old mahogany grandfather clock struck the heavy hour. The rear door handle turned with a hesitant click, and the three targets stepped inside. My Aunt Diane entered first, holding a platter of blueberry muffins, a transparent attempt to play the role of the sweet, peacemaking relative. The moment her eyes landed on the massive frame of Marcus Webb, her fake smile vanished, and her hands trembled so violently that a muffin rolled off the edge and splattered onto the floor. Richard followed close behind her, his posture stiff, his face pale from the financial crisis. My stepmother Brenda crawled in last, her jaw tight, her eyes scanning the room for any hidden escape route. Richard made a clumsy motion to pull out a chair, but Marcus Webb raised a single, thick finger. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to sit until the lawyer slowly gestured toward the three empty chairs opposite his position. The field court was officially open. Richard cleared his throat loudly, a raw sound that exposed his internal desperation. He adjusted his wool coat, trying to summon enough arrogance to look past Marcus straight at his mother. "We do not require an outsider sitting in our private kitchen to handle an internal family matter, Mom," he said, his voice carrying a forced, hollow confidence. "This is an embarrassing public display over a simple misunderstanding." Hazel did not blink. She offered no words of acknowledgement. She remained as still as ice. Marcus Webb let out a short, gravelly chuckle that carried zero warmth. He did not say a word. Instead, he simply tilted his chin upward, lifted his heavy right hand, and pushed the first manila folder across the table. The heavy document glided silently across the wood, stopping precisely against the knuckles of my father's left hand. Printed across the cover in bold black letters was a single title: Detailed Transaction Records. First, Horizon Bank. The room became so quiet that the faint scratching of a branch against the window sounded like a gunshot. Marcus Webb opened his master legal log, his thick fingers turning the pages with a slow, deliberate cadence that amplified the suspense. He did not look up at the targets. He began to read the line items aloud, his deep, baritone voice completely flat, mechanical, and entirely devoid of human emotion. On the 14th of October, a cash withdrawal of $18,000. Marcus stated cleanly, his black fountain pen slowly tapping the paper. Richard's left cheek twitched violently, a visible spasm of fear breaking through his defensive facade. On the 3rd of November, a wire transfer of $31,000 to an offshore account. The lawyer continued, his cadence steady. Richard's hand slid off the table, his fingers gripping his knees beneath the wood as a dull red flush crept up his neck. Marcus Webb paused silently for 3 long, agonizing seconds, letting the cold reality of the theft fill the kitchen like poisonous gas. He turned the page, the white paper crinkling loudly under the fluorescent light. And finally, exactly 8 weeks ago, a direct counter withdrawal of $30,000 in cash, processed hours before the scheduled flight to Europe. With every number that exploded into the room, my father's face turned a sickening shade of gray. He looked frantically to his left for a lifeline, but Diane kept her eyes locked onto the floorboards. He turned his head to look behind him for support, but Brenda had already taken a full step backward, her shoulder blades pressed flat against the drywall to separate herself from his impending collapse. The parasite alliance was fracturing under the immense weight of criminal exposure. This kitchen table had once been the primary site of my own emotional execution. 5 years ago, Richard and Diane sat in these same chairs, laughing at my stiff military uniform, telling me I would never amount to anything. They used their words to strip away my dignity. Today, the positions were completely reversed. The uniform they ridiculed had given me the strategic discipline to orchestrate this total, crushing downfall. The superficial luxury of their suits meant nothing now. The law did not care about their fake social standing. The truth was written in black toner on bank paper, and it was unyielding. Attorney Marcus Webb slowly reached deep into his old leather briefcase, his movements methodical and calm. He pulled out a secondary, heavy document bound in a bright red cover. He did not slide this one. He slammed it down onto the center of the wooden table with a heavy, echoing thud that made the plate of muffins rattle. He leaned forward, his sharp eyes locking directly onto the pale face of my aunt. Now that we have established the primary fraud, let us discuss this specific transfer of $25,000 from the retirement account, Marcus said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet whisper. What exactly was the purpose of this cash injection, Ms. Diane? The trap snapped shut, and every single eye in the room instantly pivoted toward her. Attorney Marcus Webb did not hesitate. He flipped the heavy page of the red folder, the crisp paper slicing through the stagnant air of the kitchen like a razor blade. He kept his unblinking eyes locked straight on my aunt. Ms. Diane, exactly 2 full years ago today, a direct transfer of $25,000 entered your personal checking account from this very retirement fund, Marcus stated, his voice a freezing baritone. The official banking memo filled out by your brother says emergency roof repair. But the city housing records say different. No permit was ever filed. No contractor was ever hired. Your private home roof is completely rotting to pieces. Diane froze. Her face turned a chalky shade of gray under the harsh fluorescent tube light. Her hand twitched violently, catching the rim of her glass. The cold water sloshed heavily over the plastic edge, pooling across the cold formica table and dripping slowly onto the linoleum floor. She began to gasp for air, her chest heaving as she scrambled for a defensive lie. Richard told me that money was a prearranged inheritance payout, she stammered. The desperate confession slipped out before she could stop it. She had just sold out her own brother to save her skin. Richard turned his head violently, his eyes narrowing into slits as he glared at his sister. The parasite alliance shattered into pieces right on the kitchen table. Richard exploded completely. He slammed his heavy fists down onto the bare wood table with a massive crash that made the laptop jump. He bolted upright, his chair screeching backward against the floorboards. He pointed a trembling, thick finger directly at my frozen face, his chest puffing out in a desperate display of aggressive masculinity. "This is you," he screamed, his voice reaching a raw, ragged pitch that filled the narrow kitchen. "You rigged this entire trap. You deployed this government lawyer to freeze my life so you could steal this house from under my feet. I did not blink. I did not move a single muscle in my face. My palms remained flat against the empty wooden chair, my spine perfectly straight. I let the echo of his desperate shouting die against the bare walls. I slowly tapped my index finger against the edge of the wood, a steady, mechanical rhythm. You claimed you forgot to purchase her ticket, Father, I said, my voice dead. But you planned this deployment months ago. Marcus Webb did not waste a single second of time. He slid the black printed email string and the official business class receipts directly into the center of the table. The black ink on the white paper was completely unyielding. The kitchen plunged instantly into an absolute, suffocating silence. The text of the electronic message lay completely bare under the bright glare of the overhead bulb. The cruel words written by my father's own hand stared directly back at him. The old lady is senile and half-blind anyway, so she will never notice the money is missing from the account. Right below that sentence sat the certified financial receipt for 3 premium-class airline tickets to Europe, totaling $12,600. Richard stared down at the document, his breath catching in his throat with a wet, ragged wheeze. His skin rapidly shifted from a pale gray to a deep, dark crimson red. His thick lips quivered, opening and closing like a fish suffocating on a dry dock, but no sound came out of his throat. Every single piece of his righteous middle-class protector facade was stripped away. He stood there exposed as a cheap, petty thief who had robbed his own mother to pay for luxury champagne. Behind him, my stepmother Brenda instantly clapped both of her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with pure panic as she realized she was legally linked to a federal financial crime. I looked at them, and a wave of deep, cold contempt settled into my chest. My mind briefly drifted back to the mountain outposts of Afghanistan, where the gravel was sharp and the dirt was thick. Out there in the war zone, we shared our last drop of clean water with wounded soldiers who had different names and different blood. We guarded each other's lives because honor was a concrete reality. Here, in this comfortable suburban house, a son and a daughter had spent 2 long years quietly dividing the life savings of the mother who had raised them, stripping her defenses without a single shred of human remorse. They wore expensive suits and drove premium trucks, but their souls smelled of decay. They were far more dangerous than any heavily armed foreign insurgent because they used the sacred mask of family to execute this calculated betrayal. Then the silence was broken by a movement at the head of the table. My grandmother Hazel slowly stood up from her chair. She did not rush. She leaned her thin body forward, planting her slender hands flat on the wooden surface, using her weight to support her frame. She looked directly into the bloodshot eyes of her only son. Her posture was completely erect, her jaw locked in a hard line. The fragile, broken old woman from gate B-17 was completely gone. The moment you walked away from me at that security gate, Richard, that was the exact moment I stopped believing your lies, she said, her southern drawl low, steady, and sharp as broken glass. You believed I was senile. You believed I was too stupid to remember my own life. But I forget absolutely nothing. I simply realized that I was not important enough for you to stay. She did not shed a single tear. She lifted her chin, pointing her finger toward the front door. Get out of my house. The final tactical execution was complete. Richard stood entirely paralyzed under her piercing gaze. He had nowhere left to hide in this room. The line was cut. 2 months later, the final ruling from the Knox County Family Court came down without any theatrical fanfare. There was no prison sentence handed down to my father, but the economic execution was far more painful to a man who lived entirely for his social status. The judge ordered the immediate liquidation of Richard's primary assets to fulfill his legal obligations. His brand-new metallic gray Ford F-150 truck was immediately seized by the county sheriff and sold off at a local public auction block. His beloved luxury lakefront holiday condo was forced directly onto the open real estate market to quickly clear the massive debt. The state authorities compelled him to pay back exactly $140,000 through structured monthly installments spanning over 5 long years. Furthermore, his credit history was permanently flagged with a certified black mark for elder financial fraud. The Systemic Financial Network of the United States flagged his Social Security number, completely ending any future opportunity for him to secure a bank loan or a credit line. His entire illusion of middle-class luxury was completely erased by a single judicial order. He was completely and utterly ruined financially. The structural self-destruction of the Parasite Alliance did not take long to complete once the primary source of stolen funds was cut. My Aunt Diane was forced to take out a heavy secondary mortgage on her private home to return the $25,000 she had stolen under the fake guise of a roof repair. The sheer weight of the local public humiliation crushed her remaining pride. She deleted every single one of her social media profiles, packed her belongings into a cheap moving van, and relocated to a different state in absolute silence, leaving no forwarding address. My stepmother Brenda did not waste time showing loyalty to a sinking ship. She filed for an immediate legal divorce within 3 weeks of the asset freeze, deploying her own ruthless lawyers to insulate her private personal assets from Richard's impending bankruptcy. The parasites had completely consumed their host, leaving absolutely nothing but an empty, useless shell behind in the dirt. They destroyed each other. No one called our house to offer a genuine apology. The continuous silence from my biological relatives proved that their anger was not rooted in remorse for breaking a mother's heart. Their panic came entirely from their sudden loss of money and public standing. One late evening, the silence of the kitchen was broken by the sharp vibration of my smartphone on the wooden table. I picked it up, seeing Richard's name on the dark glass screen. I pressed the answer button, keeping my body perfectly still. His voice was thin, ragged, and wet with desperate tears as he began to cry, launching into a pathetic monologue about the sacred bond of shared blood and the necessity of family forgiveness. He wept like a child, begging for a second chance. I did not let him finish his sentence. I did not offer him a single second of emotional validation. "This phone number no longer accepts calls from your area code," I said. My voice was a flat, freezing baritone. I brought my thumb down and cut the phone line before he could speak another word. The local sheriff's department served the formal restraining order the very next morning, establishing a permanent legal perimeter around our private rural property. The concrete boundary was poured and dried. There would be no second chances for a thief. We began the systematic process of cleaning the battlefield, removing every remaining trace of the people who had tried to exploit my grandmother's life. The thick manila folders containing the bank statements, transaction logs, and hacked emails were organized, closed, and locked away inside a heavy steel security drawer in the back office closet. I spent the afternoon installing a brand new network of digital ring security cameras around the outer perimeter of the house, mounting them tightly to the weathered wooden pillars of the porch. Their small blue sentinel lights began to glow steadily in the gathering darkness, monitoring the long gravel driveway with unblinking vigilance. The old ranch house was transformed into a secure compound, completely closed to outside intruders. The final piece of structural insulation happened at the worn wooden kitchen table. Hazel sat perfectly erect under the bright light, a fresh legal document resting flat against the wood. She held a black fountain pen in her slender hand, her pale fingers completely steady as she moved the metal nib across the paper. The quiet kitchen room filled entirely with the rhythmic, sharp scratching sound of her heavy pen sealing this final transfer. She was officially changing the primary beneficiary of her substantial life insurance policy, completely cutting Richard out of her legacy. The entire value of the contract was redirected to fund a permanent academic scholarship at the local county high school where she had spent 40 long years teaching English. She finished the final stroke, capped her pen, and slid the paper into a legal envelope. Every single blood tie to her old life was cleanly and permanently severed. Outside on the covered porch, the crisp December air smelled completely clean and honest, stripped of the heavy scent of cheap cologne and false promises. The faint, rhythmic mechanical sound of a carpenter's heavy iron hammer echoed from the side porch where a local blue-collar workman was finally replacing the broken, warped aluminum gutters. The house was changing, breathing again after years of slow suffocation. I stood against the wooden railing, my hands buried deep inside my jacket pockets, my expression straight as I looked out into the freezing darkness of the Tennessee Ridge. There was a deep, tranquil satisfaction settling into the marrow of my bones. We had survived the ambush. We had defended the position. The home was completely clear of the thieves, and the baseline of our reality was finally restored to absolute order. The battle was won. The line was drawn in stone. Spring brought a profound revival of life to the rural ridge. The winter winds of Tennessee broke, replaced by a warm breeze carrying the scent of wet earth. Outside, the broken, warped aluminum gutters had been completely replaced with solid new steel tracks that caught the morning rain without a single leak. Inside the house, the ancient furnace no longer rumbled with a dying groan. It hummed quietly and steadily, maintaining a comfortable, enveloping warmth of 72 degrees Fahrenheit through every room. The dark kitchen, once a cold and hollow space of deprivation, felt alive. The old refrigerator was fully stocked with fresh vegetables, crisp greens, and thick cuts of fresh meat from the local butcher. Every single Friday morning, my grandmother Hazel went to the local beauty salon to get her hair done, and every single weekend evening she enjoyed a long dinner at Cracker Barrel with her old friend Loretta. The frail, pale, 74-year-old woman who had been abandoned like garbage at the security gate of the airport was completely gone. In her place stood a woman who looked a full decade younger, her skin radiant and her blue eyes filled with a sharp, renewed vitality. The financial bloodsucker had been completely removed from her life, and the host was finally thriving, growing strong in the sunlight. On Saturday afternoon, the kitchen was bathed in bright light. Hazel stood at the wooden counter, her slender fingers steady as she held an old, seasoned cast-iron skillet, using it to measure out yellow cornmeal for a fresh batch of skillet cornbread. The rich, sweet aroma of baking bread already filled the air, warming the entire space. I stood against the doorframe, my arms crossed over my chest, wearing a simple, faded olive-drab, short-sleeved military undershirt. My boots were clean. Resting directly on the floor by my feet was the old, scuffed leather suitcase from 1994. Its surface covered in heavy vinyl repair patches and worn straps. I reached down, my thumb catching the heavy metal tab, and pulled it back. The zipper opened with a sharp, crisp, mechanical click that echoed through the quiet kitchen. Resting inside the mesh storage pocket of the open lid were 2 official, premium-class international airline tickets to Paris, France, scheduled for the middle of October. The booking was finalized, and the entire balance was fully paid. This time, there was a real itinerary. This time, nobody was going to be left behind at a security checkpoint while a parasite ran off with the funds. I walked slowly over to the kitchen window and looked out into the yard, watching the bright green buds pushing their way through the ancient bark of the old oak tree. The cycle of seasons was turning, burying the ugly winter of betrayal under a fresh layer of life. My mind briefly flashed back to the dusty mountain roads of Afghanistan, where family was defined by the person who held the medical gauze over your wound while the sky turned red. Out there on the front lines, we did not share a bloodline, but we shared an absolute commitment to protect each other from the predators in the dark. I looked back at Hazel, who was calmly sliding the heavy cast-iron skillet into the hot oven, her movements smooth and deliberate. I never had a real father in my life, and I never would. Richard was a biological accident, a small, selfish thief who used the sacred word of family to camouflage his greed. But I did not need his validation anymore. I had deployed my training, my discipline, and my tactical skills to accomplish the most critical mission of my entire life. I had saved the strongest, most resilient general I had ever known. I rested my hand against the cold glass of the window pane, my voice barely a whisper in the warm kitchen room. Leaving would have been much easier, I said quietly to myself, my dark eyes fixed on the distant ridgeline. But staying here was the right thing to do. Out there in the war zone, shedding hot blood on the cold gravel created an unbreakable tactical connection between soldiers. But back here at home, in the quiet spaces of everyday survival, it was absolute loyalty that truly defined the meaning of family. We had built a solid iron fortress out of a broken home, and the foundation was poured deep in solid concrete. Before I officially close this log and transition into the next tactical operation, I need to hear your voice in this bunker with me. If you have ever been forced to use a cold, unyielding boundary to protect an elderly family member, or if you believe that loyalty is earned through actions rather than a shared bloodline, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel right now. Your support keeps our perimeters secure against these parasites. Drop a single word in the comments section below. Type the word loyalty if you stand with Hazel, or tell me if you have ever had to draw a line in the dirt against your own flesh and blood. Let us show the world that we do not stay silent when predators try to exploit the people who raised us. Share this broadcast with someone who needs the strength to fight back. I turned away from the window, the warm smell of the baked cornbread finally filling the room as Hazel closed the oven door with a solid, satisfying thud. She looked up at me, a soft, knowing smile playing on her lips, her eyes clear and entirely at peace. She did not need to say a single word of thanks. The open leather suitcase on the floor and the 2 Paris tickets resting in the light said absolutely everything that mattered. The mission was complete. The defense was secure. I walked over to the kitchen table, sat down in my chair, and prepared to share a meal with my true family.